Hey y'all, welcome to Inflect. I'm Michael Daehne, and on today's show, I'm joined by Pedro Cortez and Liz Pryor from the FlexPoint team, and we're going to be talking about preparing for your transformation. Really glad to have two of my team members here today who have so much experience envisioning, planning, and implementing large-scale business and technology transformation initiatives, and they're going to share some of their war stories. We're calling this kind of a behind the scenes of the blog post they wrote earlier this month. So looking forward to the conversation. And before we get into that, I want to give Pedro and Liz a chance to introduce themselves. So Pedro, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Pedro Cortez. I am one of the directors here at FlexPoint on digital transformation. And one of the focus areas I've had over my career has really been in product management and in program management. So I have a tendency to come into these implementation programs either at the very beginning and help navigate them through the early decisions of what business goals need to be attained and how we're trying to move forward. And sometimes we get brought in midstream trying to figure out where things have gone wrong and how do we correct the missteps that have taken place from there. So yeah, looking forward to today's conversation.
And I'm Liz Pryor. My background is mostly in the software development, custom software world. And I was there for 5-6 years. And from there, I translated it into more of this data transformation. So how do you take the requirements and what's needed behind the scenes to then build the thing? And now we're taking something that's already built and trying to make it better and build the new thing.
Awesome. So glad to have you both here. And for those who haven't read the blog post and the series of blog posts really that y'all put together, the kind of overarching theme of it is, hey, don't wait for your large project or transformation to start before you start working on some of the kind of key enabling activities, decision-making, communications processes, and really defining the scope and the approach to the transformation. There's a lot of that stuff you can get ahead of. And so with the new year comes an opportunity for organizations to start doing some of that pre-work, even as they may still be in the discovery phases and thinking through, hey, what investments are we going to make? What changes, what transformations are we going to invest in this year? And so you put together a really awesome kind of 3-part framework around preparing the organization, defining the transformation, and planning the transformation. Pedro, maybe just briefly speak to kind of what we mean by each of those 3 buckets, and then we'll get into some war stories and other lessons learned y'all have to share.
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to, as businesses decide they want to make improvements and get better, either more effective, more efficient, more profitable, they're looking for ways to make changes. A lot of it has to do with the way they're changing their business strategy, their approach, the way they view their product lines, or the new technologies they want to implement in order to kind of get them over the hump and take on these new objectives and goals. So when we looked at it, we kind of broke it down into 3 phases, right? So in preparing for the organization, like what are the things you really need to think about? If you've decided that, hey, look, we're at an inflection point, it's time for us to make a move. What do we need to consider in making that leap? Because it is going to require investment, both in time and resources, on top of, financial implications to it. And then once you've kind of done some of that, initial thought processing and trying to figure out where you need to go, then it's defining, well, what objectives do we want to meet, right? We're not just doing this for the sake of modernizing, right? Too many business transformations have failed that, hey, here's the next new technology. We should adopt it, right? But really kind of honing in on defining what it is we want to meet, what's the objective we want to reach, what's our business goals we want to drive towards. And then once we kind of define that, then laying out, well, what does this transformation look like, right? Let's plan for it. What do we need to prepare for? So Liz and I put some thoughts together on what that framework should look like, as you're moving into these concepts of, these transformations for my business and how do we become bigger, better, stronger, faster? What should you be considering as a business if this is a leap you're getting ready to make?
Yeah, great. And I think what I loved about the framework y'all put together is it's not just about the project. It starts with the organization. So right before you can start talking about the work you're going to do on a specific project, it's like, how do we work together? How do we communicate? How do we share decision-making across the organization? What are our delivery models? Kind of all those key questions. But once you do kind of start defining the transformation, scoping it, planning it, Liz, can you share any examples of maybe some of the tactics? I think y'all mentioned gap sessions and some other ideas in your blog post, but tactics you may have used in the past to kind of get everyone on the same page about the work to be done and kind of the scope and approach of the transformation.
Sure. So something that we did before we'd sit down and map out what were some of those key business processes that both systems need to support or both companies need to support. So when you know what that main pipe that everything needs to go through looks like, and you're able to kind of define what the boundaries of that are, you know where you're working. Anything from there would be more specific, but just sitting down, where's your freeway before you build the country roads?
Yeah. Were there any other things kind of early on in the planning phase that decisions you made or discussions you had that later on, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months later, you were really glad you had the kind of those decisions or discussions because it maybe got everyone on the same page before you kind of got into the fire of the project?
So one thing that we did sit down and do is when an issue would arise or when there was a defect or when there'd be a problem, we mapped out who gets told what when down to a schedule so people knew when to expect updates. I think it really saved us down the line to not have people blowing up phones or blowing you up over email when the issue came up. They knew what to expect, they knew when to expect it. And that simple little trick saved us time down the road.
Just to interject a little more into that, in that preparation phase, right, it's setting up the roles and responsibilities for the people that are going to be on the team, right? You want to clearly define that at the outset, right? Who gets to participate in the decision-making process? Who are people that need to be consulted, right? We've heard the term RACI before, right? Who's responsible, accountable, needs to be consulted or just informed, right? That's a great framework to start from. We've talked about looking at it from a DARE perspective. So you kind of change the order and you're making some deciders in the room and they get certain votes. And, this communication plan is critical to success of any of these transformations, and knowing who the right person to go to, who's your throughput, who's your front door in order to take on this task. Having that defined by the people who are going to be engaged in the project is critical. Otherwise, you might have informed somebody, hey, we've got a problem, or, to Liz's example, right? People could have gotten a phone call who I know that they've worked with defects in the past. I'm going to pick up the phone and call them. It might have been effective for them in the past, but it's 3 a.m. and they're not really the ones on call. So what are they going to do? They're going to pick up the phone and call the person who's actually on call that night, responsible for defect triage, for this go live. And all we're doing is upsetting the apple tree when we've got, clearly delineated process you could be following. And you want to get those articulated early on so that way you can follow those and know who to go through, right? That playbook gets established early on and just rely on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a good call out. And I think on the idea of kind of building a playbook and getting everyone aligned on the ways of working, Pedro, I know you've spent a lot of time in your career kind of on I'll say the delivery model or work management side of how do we work together? What's our cadence, our approach, the tooling we're using? Share more about kind of that and how you've approached that early on, kind of when you're still in that preparation and planning phase.
Yeah, I think one of the early decisions that has to be made is how are you going to handle the day-to-day operations while we're going through the transformation effort, right? Is the transformation work, the project research, the discovery, is that all going to be done as peanut butter spread on top of people's day jobs? Or is the company going to be supportive enough and invest enough to go find temporary support, right? Contractors, consultancy, whatever, to bring people in to help with the day-to-day operations and train them on that with the team that's going to be supplanted, right, to go take on this new transformation. So it really starts there, right? The resource planning, who's going to be dedicated to the project? Again, we talked about roles a second ago, right? Who's going to take on what role within, the decision tree for this transformation? But then it's getting your processes and protocols kind of laid out. Are we happy with waterfall? Do we like using all the artifacts? Has that been beneficial for us? Waterfall's not dead necessarily. People still use it today. It's reliable. It's predictable. There's value to that if it's a known way of replacing, legacy systems or legacy work. But in today's environment, we're seeing more and more clients move towards an agile delivery methodology and using those frameworks more because the feedback turnaround is so much faster, right? You can get into a discovery session on Monday, and by Wednesday, people are bringing stories back to you and you can evaluate, hey, is the interpretation correct? Is the acceptance criteria what I would expect it to be, and that it actually meets my needs when this widget gets built in the end? So that feedback loop, is really critical in why the turnaround in Agile is so much faster and why you tend to see more successful throughput because you're eliminating the development waste on the front side of that. So not to turn this into an agile podcast, but in essence, the thing that we're trying to do with these clients that really want to move towards that agility framework is provide more of that customer interaction face to face, get more of the feedback in a faster turnaround time, do things in prototype mode. There's nothing wrong with laying things out in PowerPoint or some other visualization tool that says, hey, this is what it might look like. This is what the architecture could be. Visio is a great tool to go out and lay out what some of these sketches and schemes could look like without actually having to put hands on keyboard and code. So when you put these prototypes in front of people, now they have a chance to evaluate, oh, is this going to get me what I need? Am I getting the expected result that I'm hoping to achieve at the end of it? Am I reaching my goals? So that's really where some of those frameworks will become critical in deciding, well, which one of these two paths leads my company towards success? And then sometimes you got to reevaluate that midstream, right? You're a year in, you're 18 months into the program, and either you're on track and keep going, or things aren't coming as fast as I need them to, or they're not coming in a particular way. We're not seeing success. And now it's time to reevaluate, not just your resources and teams, and do we have people who are in the right positions to make this program successful, but are we using the right, methods? Do we have the right frameworks in place? Have we, set ourselves up for success? Some of the things that we've seen at some of our client sites, we've had people who've wanted to make that transition from waterfall to agile, and they do it without training, right? And they just reassign a project manager to a scrum master role. They take a BA and make them a product owner. In some cases, that's fine. It works really well. In other places, it doesn't. We've seen the opposite take place too, right? They're like, well, we tried agile. We want to go back to waterfall, but we have all these people who have these agile titles. So let's move them back into their previous, what would align to their previous role. Again, it's met with mixed results, at the end. And ultimately, the program leads and the leadership have to get behind, hey, we're going to experiment or we're not. And if we're not going to experiment, how do we get to that predictability so that we can get the end result we're looking for? A lot of this comes down to the goals. What are the goals of the transformational project? What does the leadership want to get out of this? And how do they best align the results they want to get to what they're actually seeing in the program?
And I will say, if anyone was going to turn this into an agile conversation, it would be you, Pedro. So you're allowed to do that. I think one interesting thing in reading the content you all put together about planning for and kind of the pre-work you can do on these big projects is, I think there's this natural tension between keeping planning very high level. Like when you say planning, like, oh, keep it high level. We'll get into the details later. There's tension between that and the fact that you kind of need to get into some of the details to build a good plan. And I'm curious, Liz, maybe if you have any thoughts or kind of lessons, tips around how you balance those two things when you're in still that kind of pre-work phase, and maybe examples from your past where you did get down in the weeds or in the details and it paid off down the road because you invested the time up front.
I worked on a dashboard project back in the day, and knowing how the data was coming in actually ended up changing the scope of the project. So initially we thought it was going to come in daily batch file, and found out down the case that it was not. So having that very defined, this is how we're getting it, working with the architects directly at the very beginning of the project really helped. Because when we talked to the more business side of the folks, they did not understand accurately how their data was getting where it needed to be. So jumping on the phone early on with those people really helped.
I think one really resonant thing in your comment there is the idea of, you said, hey, got to talk to the architects, talk to the business. I think that's something we see a lot when we're working on planning discovery type work with clients, is it really matters that you talk to all the right people. Because I think sometimes there's a risk of saying, yeah, we have this one guy or this one person that's working. They've been working on this plan for a long time. They're working on it. They're figuring out the scope. They're going to get vendors, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, hey, has that person talked to the key business users? Has that person talked to enterprise architecture, data, their information security, all these different groups? And that takes time and it's harder, but that's also why I think there's so much value and opportunity in doing more of the planning and pre-work before you get into the project, because you can make sure you get all the right voices kind of in the room and represented.
There's a balance to be had there, right? And that's always a tough chord to strike. You got to find where that line is, because in any project, you're fighting the triangle all the time, right? It's scope, time, money, right? And people want to bring new scope because, in the legacy system, they've got all these pain points they would like to eliminate, right? They want to make their daily operations easier, right? Make it simpler on themselves, make it faster. Because again, if I can get more throughput, right, I can be more productive, and that means more opportunity for more widgets, right? So you try to correlate that back out to sales. But that scope creep tends to end up creating either a longer timeline, which some places you just can't do that, right? You've got a finite amount of time to get this in, or it's going to end up costing you more money in resources because your timeline's not going to move. So you need to bring more people in to get more work done in that same period of time. So there's always a balance because, yeah, you would love to create the ultimate customer experience, in every, business transformation, regardless of what the scope is. But there's a chord to be struck there with governance and oversight, and I think in every program we've ever been in, right, there's some type of governance structure that's in place to say, yeah, we could add that. And other places like, no, can't really do that because it costs, exorbitantly more to bring in a different tool, change a decision on a previously decided upon tool, or even, elongating the time frame. It's just not acceptable, right? So, we don't want to take on the additional cost for additional resources. So there's always a balance to be struck there, and it's hard to find. In some places, it can go beyond what the original intent was. We've got, Liz and I have a war story where we work together where, there was this massive M&A program, and part of that transformation was, consolidating two billing platforms, two ordering platforms, consolidating into a single tool. And they pre-selected the vendor, they pre-selected the tools they wanted to put in, and they gave a rough estimate of what that cost would look like. And when the teams actually came together and had a gap session and looked at all the capabilities they wanted to translate into the new world, right? What was the new future state going to look like? The estimate was almost 2x of what the original estimate was. And everybody lost their mind. Like, what do you mean it's going to be 2x of what the original estimate was? We got to cut. So all of a sudden there was scope being eliminated. There were teams being eliminated from the program, and they were trying to deliver an MVP solution that would meet, the current state needs. They were trying to create parity, but ultimately what they ended up doing was creating a state of bare metal where they could make zero mistakes, right? They had to completely restructure the way they were working, completely retool who was going to be part of the program, finding cheaper resources, which sometimes delivered parity, but sometimes delivered less, lower quality in the end result. So like I said, there's a fine line to walk there. And sometimes you fall off the cliff, and other times it's fine. You can kind of retool and reforecast and rebudget, but it's hard. That's one of the hardest things in project management and program management, is trying to find where does that line exist and how do you walk it?
Well said. Always natural tension there. Okay, I have one more question on this topic, and I got a couple lightning round questions for y'all. So the last one on this topic is, as you think about kind of the experiences you've had and the reflections you shared in the blog post around preparing for large transformation, what's your number one tip? Of all the things you talked about and we've discussed today, what's the number one thing that you would recommend to clients that are preparing to embark on a big transformation project?
Be prepared that the unexpected will happen. Know that there's going to be something you didn't know. There's something will happen that you didn't plan for. The unexpected will occur. So what will you do when you face that unexpected? Defining that upfront will help you down the road.
Yeah, I would add on to what Liz said. It's not just prepare for the unexpected, is you need to budget for it as well. And I don't just mean in financial dollars, right? It's how, if you were to put all your funding in up front and say, look, you're locked into a budget. Here's what you're trying to do. This is all you can play with. It's hard getting to the end result, because you're always battling the dollars, because if it's more than 60 days to get the program completed, the market's going to move. Cost of staffing, cost of technology, cost of resourcing, all that's going to go up. So you've got to create some type of inflation spin there. The way I would go about it is I really encourage clients to go think about it in terms of placing bets or investments. I'm going to give you a quarterly investment of this much. Go spend it for the next 3 months in these areas. These are the focus points, as our transformation plan looks like, right? Creating these roadmaps. Where do we want to be in 24 months, 36 months? For the next 3, here are the things we want to be able to do. So let's invest in dollars today for that and keep a pool available to jump into the next quarter and the quarter after that and the quarter after that. So I'd say, think about this from a budgeting standpoint, not just in today's dollars, but looking over the overall program to get you to the transformation goals you want to reach. Invest in it on a quarterly basis and just keep placing those bets again. Because you can pivot in 3 months from now and say, you know what? The market's moved. We no longer want that to be our goal. We have a new goal to reach. So we need to change the way we address our transformation. Instead of being locked into a budget and an approach and a long-term plan, it's just reinvest that in every 3 months.
Love that. Great advice. Okay, a couple lightning round questions. So first of all, best book or podcast or movie you've consumed recently that you would recommend to our listeners?
That's not fair. There have been so many good books I've been reading on product management. I'm a big fan of Melissa Perry's Avoiding the Bill Trap. I think there are too many organizations that we've had either as clients or we've heard, in consulting powwows with friends of ours who have talked about, hey, I got to keep my developers busy. I got to keep my testers busy. So I'm feeding them stories. I'm feeding them work, just to keep them maximized on the utilization because they got to be busy. Like, I don't agree with that at all. It's like you really should take your resources and help them get into your discovery, take questions from their lens and help them build a better product, build a better widget. So a lot of that philosophy comes from her book. The product kata is also in there. I think it's a great thing to lean into for companies that are going through their transformations and want to be more product centric. I think that's absolutely great. I'm about to finish Amazon's book, Working Backwards. I think it's phenomenal as well. It tells a story of how Amazon has gone through their transformation and became who they were. I think one of the really cool things they talk about is writing their press releases and their FAQs before they ever get into discovery. Like, what do they want this next thing to be? And then work backwards to where they're really taking into account the customer experience and what the technologies need to be that underlie it, not thinking about the technology that's going to drive their future. You got great stories in there about how Prime came to be, their predecessor to that, things that they did with Amazon Web Services. It is just again, really cool read to kind of just foundationally figure out, this is the way one company went about approaching it. And Michael, this too. Again, I wasn't going to give you one. Simon Sinek's book all around, discovering your why. I really think, All Starts With Why was his first book. Loved it. And it really set the foundation for the golden circle and how we apply that in our everyday lives and really trying to drive towards the why a company exists and how do the products and services they offer feed that, right? More than just talking about the bells and whistles that come with it. So I'd recommend any of those three.
I'd say Think Again by Adam Grant. I really enjoyed his book. He did a really great job of just kind of reframing how to think through problems and how to interpret how other people are presenting problems to you. So you can keep a 360 view of what's going on. Podcast wise, I would recommend anything Malcolm Gladwell, Revisionist History, big fan of. And another good one that I just started listening to is called Your Undivided Attention. The two hosts are Asa Raskin and Tristan Harris, but they try and take a very human approach to technology. So as we are getting more into AI and as you're starting to see more things like smart refrigerators, how do we continue on that path of technology coming into the home without it being creepy? And they talk about that often. And I just think the subject matter is interesting.
Awesome. I'll have to check that out. And I do love both Adam Grant and Malcolm Gladwell, and Adam Grant's other new book, Hidden Potential. You heard that or read that? That is a really good one. Would highly recommend. And thank you both for giving us like 85 book and podcast recommendations in the lightning round. That's awesome. No shortage of recommendations. Okay. Something we have not talked about at all, but is true about all three of us is that we're all huge sports fans. I have allegiances a little further south in Texas than the two of you do in the Dallas area, but nonetheless, we all root for Texas teams. So we're going to end on this one. What's your all-time favorite sports moment?
Corey Seager's home run. Just picturing game. Was it 6 of the World Series this past year that sealed it for us?
All right. So that was a good one. For me, though, I have to go back to Texas USC in the Rose Bowl, playing for the national championship and watching Vince Young break from the middle on a quarterback scramble and hitting the end zone on the right side for ended up being the winning touchdown in that game and brought Texas its most recent national championship. So that one sticks in the memory a lot of just great sports moments for me personally.
I think this answers the question, why do I have a podcast? And it's to talk about Vince Young in 2005 in the Rose Bowl. So, I'm glad we can end on that note. I really appreciate y'all joining and talking about planning and preparing for large transformations. For all of our listeners, if you want to read more, there's a great series of blog posts out on flexpointconsulting.com and on our LinkedIn page that Pedro and Liz and some of our other team members contributed to as well. So yeah, really appreciate you listening, and thanks for a great discussion.
Thanks, Michael.